When the United States entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, millions of American men answered the call to arms. Among them was a young Virginian named Desmond Doss, born in Lynchburg, Virginia, on February 7, 1919. Yet Doss's decision to enlist was unlike that of most others. A devout member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, he believed in the sanctity of life and the strict observance of the Ten Commandments, including, "Thou shalt not kill." His faith prohibited him from taking a human life or even carrying a weapon. At the same time, his patriotism and sense of duty compelled him to serve his country in its time of need. Doss's convictions were shaped by both religion and family experience. His father, William Doss, was a World War I veteran who suffered from the psychological scars of combat. Growing up during the Great Depression, Desmond witnessed the effects of violence within his own home after his father's drinking and trauma led to domestic conflict. A violent altercation between his father and uncle nearly ended in tragedy when Desmond intervened, pointing his father's pistol away and making a vow never to touch a weapon again. The combination of these events, reinforced by his faith's teachings, set the foundation for his lifelong commitment to nonviolence. When the draft expanded after Pearl Harbor, Doss could have sought exemption as a conscientious objector, but he refused to avoid service. Instead, he chose to participate as a conscientious cooperator, willing to serve but unwilling to kill. Under U.S. law, the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 recognized conscientious objectors, allowing them to perform non-combatant duties or civilian work in lieu of military service. However, the law did not ensure that such men would be treated with understanding within the armed forces. In practice, they were often viewed with suspicion, derision, or outright hostility by both officers and enlisted men who saw refusal to bear arms as cowardice or disloyalty. Doss reported for duty in April 1942 at Camp Lee, Virginia, before being transferred to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, for basic training. He was assigned to the 77th Infantry Division, which would later fight across the Pacific. The Army placed him in the medical detachment, the most fitting role for someone who refused to carry a weapon but was eager to save lives. Yet the institutional framework did little to protect him from the prejudice of those around him. Within his unit, many soldiers viewed him as unreliable or even dangerous, a man who, in their eyes, would not defend them if attacked. Training at Fort Jackson was designed to toughen recruits through rigorous physical conditioning, weapons drills, and discipline. For Doss, this environment immediately posed a challenge. As a Seventh-day Adventist, he observed the Sabbath from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, during which he refused to perform non-essential duties. He also avoided meat and sought to follow his faith's health codes, which made him stand out further among soldiers accustomed to the uniformity of military life. These habits quickly drew attention, and not the kind that earned respect. Doss's refusal to touch a rifle caused friction from the start. His commanding officers pressured him to carry a weapon during training exercises, citing unit safety and military necessity. When he refused, they accused him of insubordination and even attempted to remove him from service through psychiatric evaluation. Fellow soldiers mocked him as a Holy Joe, harassed him in the barracks, and ostracized him during drills. Some officers used him as an example of what not to be, a man supposedly too weak or cowardly to fight. Despite this, Doss remained calm and respectful. He performed all required physical tasks, including obstacle courses and forced marches, often excelling in endurance and medical proficiency. His steadfast attitude began to draw quiet attention from a few observant officers. He made it clear that he did not oppose the war itself. Rather, he opposed killing. His intention was to serve as a medic, to save lives rather than take them. The U.S. Army Medical Department had long relied on medics as unarmed personnel trained in emergency treatment, evacuation, and battlefield triage. While most medics carried pistols for self-defense, regulations did not mandate that they do so. This loophole allowed Doss to continue his service without compromising his beliefs. He studied medical manuals, memorized treatment techniques, and volunteered for additional aid station duties. His determination to master medical procedures impressed certain superiors who began to recognize his potential value in combat operations. The situation at Fort Jackson reached a breaking point when Doss's refusal to handle weapons was formally challenged. His commanding officer filed charges seeking his discharge under Section 8 for mental instability. Doss requested a military hearing and defended himself by citing the constitutional right to religious freedom and the Army's own policy allowing non-combatant roles. The review board concluded that he was mentally fit and legally entitled to serve as a medic without carrying a weapon. It was a turning point, not only for Doss personally, but for how the Army interpreted conscientious objection within a combat division. Even after the ruling, hostility within his unit persisted. During field exercises, some men deliberately endangered him, leaving him exposed during simulated combat. Others refused to march beside him. Yet over time, his quiet competence began to earn limited respect. He treated training injuries without complaint, assisted others during physical exhaustion, and remained the last to leave every drill area, ensuring no man was left unattended. His actions gradually contradicted the assumption that a soldier without a weapon lacked courage. The U.S. Army at that time was still adapting to the presence of conscientious objectors. Roughly 37,000 Americans registered as such during the war, and many were sent to civilian public service camps instead of combat zones. Only a small minority, like Doss, insisted on serving within combat units. Their role tested the Army's capacity to accommodate religious conviction within the rigid structure of total war. In Doss's case, it created a precedent for non-combat heroism within one of the bloodiest branches of service, the infantry. By late 1943, the 77th Infantry Division, nicknamed Statue of Liberty Division, completed its stateside training and prepared for deployment to the Pacific. The division had been reorganized for amphibious warfare, with medical detachments integrated into each battalion. Doss's duties included administering first aid under fire, stabilizing wounded soldiers, and coordinating evacuation from frontline positions. His formal designation was Private First Class, Medical Aidman, Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment. Before departure, the division conducted final maneuvers and simulated beach assaults. Doss consistently demonstrated exceptional physical endurance. Despite his pacifism, he never hesitated to train under the same grueling conditions as armed troops. Officers began to take note of his reliability under stress. Some soldiers who had previously mocked him began to quietly rely on him for medical support during exercises. One sergeant later recalled that while they still didn't understand his refusal to fight, they could not question his commitment to his comrades. The Army's medical training emphasized quick assessment, hemorrhage control, shock prevention, and evacuation under fire. All skills Doss absorbed rapidly. He also memorized the contents and application of the Army Medical Kit, Unit Number 7, which included bandages, morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, and plasma. He practiced field dressing, splinting, and litter carrying until his performance was near flawless. His methodical attention to procedure impressed even skeptical instructors. The transformation of perception at Fort Jackson reflected a broader evolution occurring within the Army. As manpower demands grew and casualties mounted across the Pacific and European theaters, the role of medics gained heightened importance. Doss's presence as a non-combatant became less a curiosity and more a test case for how far the Army could extend its inclusivity without undermining combat effectiveness. By early 1944, after nearly 2 years of training and administrative delay, Doss's unit received deployment orders to the Pacific Theater. The division embarked from the continental United States toward the Mariana Islands to participate in the campaign for Guam. The men who once questioned his courage would soon see his beliefs tested under the most brutal conditions of the war. Doss's journey from Fort Jackson to the Pacific represented more than personal endurance. It was an institutional shift within the U.S. Army toward recognizing that valor did not depend solely on the ability to kill an enemy. He remained steadfast in his refusal to carry a weapon, carrying instead his Bible and medical kit into battle. For the Army, he was now both a logistical necessity and a moral anomaly, a soldier who sought to save life amidst a war defined by industrial-scale destruction. As his transport ship crossed the Pacific, Doss faced uncertainty about how he would perform under real combat conditions. He had survived ridicule, legal challenge, and isolation. But the true test lay ahead. On the islands of Guam, Leyte, and ultimately Okinawa, his convictions would collide directly with the realities of modern warfare. Yet the foundation for everything he achieved in those battles was laid at Fort Jackson, where one man's determination to serve without killing forced the U.S. Army to reconsider what courage and duty could mean in the midst of World War II. By mid-1944, the United States had gained the strategic initiative in the Pacific. The campaigns in the Solomons and the Gilberts had broken Japan's outer defensive ring, and the next objective lay in the Marianas, a vital chain of islands that included Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Their capture would place American heavy bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. To accomplish this, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps launched one of the largest amphibious operations of the war. Among the forces committed was the 77th Infantry Division, the unit to which Private First Class Desmond Doss belonged. The 77th Infantry Division, originally activated during World War I, had been reactivated for World War II in March 1942. After extensive training in amphibious operations, it became part of the 24th Corps, assigned to the U.S. 10th Army for Pacific operations. The division was composed of 3 infantry regiments, the 305th, 306th, and 307th, supported by artillery, engineers, and medical detachments. Doss served as a combat medic in Company B, 307 Infantry Regiment, part of the 1st Battalion. In June 1944, the division boarded troop transports and sailed west across the Pacific to join the invasion of Guam. The island had been an American possession before its capture by Japan in December 1941, and retaking it was both a strategic and symbolic objective. The Japanese garrison numbered around 18,000 troops, deeply entrenched in caves, ridges, and jungles. The terrain, combined with the tropical climate, posed severe challenges for infantry and medics alike. The Battle of Guam began on July 21, 1944, when U.S. Marines landed on the western beaches, followed by elements of the 77th Infantry Division to the north. Japanese defenses were intense from the moment the landing craft hit the beaches. Heavy machine gun fire, mortars, and artillery struck the assault waves. Casualties mounted rapidly, and the work of medics like Doss began before they had even cleared the surf zone. Doss's duties included retrieving the wounded from exposed positions, applying field dressings, and coordinating evacuation to the beach aid stations. Without a weapon, he moved through shell fire carrying only his medical kit and Bible. The chaos of the landings left many soldiers pinned down or isolated. Doss repeatedly advanced into fire-swept areas to treat men where they fell. often crawling forward on his stomach to avoid detection. His actions during the early phase of the Guam campaign marked his first direct exposure to combat medicine under live fire. The fighting on Guam soon moved inland into dense jungle. Japanese defenders, operating from concealed positions, fought tenaciously. Doss's regiment participated in the seizure of the Mount Alifan and Mount Tenjo areas, where combat took place at close quarters and visibility was limited to a few yards. Under such conditions, medical evacuation was extremely difficult. Doss often had to improvise stretchers from branches or web belts and drag wounded men down steep, muddy slopes to reach aid posts. The U.S. Army Medical Corps relied heavily on frontline medics to stabilize casualties until litter teams or jeeps could transport them rearward. The standard field treatment involved stopping bleeding, preventing shock, and administering sulfa powder and morphine syrettes to prevent infection and manage pain. Doss quickly mastered these procedures and became known for his calm under pressure. Despite the skepticism he had faced at Fort Jackson, his actions on Guam began changing the opinions of those around him. Soldiers who once ridiculed him now sought him instinctively when wounded men went down. The 77th Division suffered over 7,000 casualties on Guam, including killed and wounded. Doss was constantly on duty, often working for 24 hours without rest. His endurance and willingness to expose himself to danger for others became evident to both his platoon and his officers. One sergeant later remarked that Doss would go into hell for a wounded man. The division secured Guam on August 10, 1944. But for Doss and his comrades, the campaign had demonstrated the extreme physical and psychological demands of Pacific warfare. After a short period of rest and reorganization, the 77th Division was redeployed to participate in the Philippine Campaign, the largest Allied operation in the Pacific up to that point. The recapture of the Philippines was essential to isolate Japan from its southern resources and provide bases for future operations. Doss's regiment was assigned to the invasion of Leyte, which began in October 1944 under General Douglas MacArthur's command. The Battle of Leyte was characterized by heavy rain, mud, and constant Japanese counterattacks. The terrain, a mix of rice paddies, ridges, and jungles, turned into a quagmire that hampered movement and evacuation. Doss and the other medics faced an endless stream of casualties as the 77th advanced through the island's central sector. Japanese resistance came not only from entrenched infantry, but also from artillery, hidden in the hills, and snipers concealed in trees. During one engagement near the Pina Hill sector, Doss's company was pinned down by enemy machine gun fire. Several men were hit in open ground. Without hesitation, Doss crawled forward under fire to reach them. He applied bandages, administered morphine, and dragged the wounded back one by one, often within yards of Japanese positions. Witnesses later testified that his refusal to carry a weapon never translated into hesitation. Instead, he seemed entirely focused on his task, treating the wounded regardless of the danger. As the battle progressed, Doss's efficiency under fire became indispensable. The 307th Regiment faced intense combat at Ormoc Valley, one of the bloodiest engagements on Leyte. The valley was heavily defended by Japanese artillery and mortars, and the thick jungle amplified the effects of every explosion. Evacuation routes were frequently blocked, forcing medics to treat soldiers in place while shells fell around them. Doss's reputation grew among both his own unit and neighboring companies. Soldiers began calling for him by name when injured, a sign of the trust he had earned. By December 1944, the Leyte campaign was winding down, but Japanese resistance persisted in pockets across the island. The 77th Division was then tasked with another major operation, the assault on Yaeshima, a small island off Okinawa, and later Okinawa itself. Before the Okinawa invasion, however, Doss's record on Guam and Leyte had already distinguished him. His superiors submitted multiple recommendations for the Bronze Star Medal, which he received with a V device for valor. The citation specifically mentioned his outstanding bravery and devotion to duty in saving numerous lives under enemy fire. These early Pacific campaigns forged the operational pattern that would define Doss's service. Constant exposure to danger, relentless focus on medical duty, and complete absence of personal armament. His method was simple. Advance as far forward as possible, treat the wounded where they fell, and assist in their removal to safety. He carried his medical kit, a few bandages, plasma bottles, and occasionally a rope for improvised rescues. Conditions in the Pacific placed extraordinary strain on medical personnel. Disease, heat exhaustion, and malnutrition were constant threats. The jungle environment accelerated infection, and the humid air degraded medical supplies. Doss's adherence to personal hygiene, partly rooted in his Adventist health practices, allowed him to remain operational when others fell ill. He maintained a vegetarian diet as much as possible and often gave his rations to others. By the beginning of 1945, the 77th Infantry Division had earned a reputation for endurance and effectiveness in amphibious operations. It was assigned to participate in the Okinawa Campaign, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The operation's goal was to secure Okinawa as a staging ground for the eventual invasion of Japan. Intelligence reports warned of an estimated 100,000 Japanese troops entrenched in complex defensive systems across the island. For medics, the upcoming battle promised unprecedented casualties. The journey from Guam to Okinawa took several weeks, during which Doss continued to serve his comrades on board ship, providing medical assistance and instruction in first aid. His commanding officers now fully accepted his status as a combat medic who would not carry a weapon but could be relied upon under the worst conditions. The earlier skepticism had largely vanished. Soldiers who once shunned him now requested to be assigned near him, knowing that if they were wounded, Doss would reach them regardless of the risk. The 77th Division landed on Okinawa in April 1945. The initial stages of the invasion were met with light resistance, as Japanese forces withdrew inland to prepared positions. The true battle would begin when American forces reached the island's southern escarpments, particularly the area around the Leyte escarpment, later known to history as Hacksaw Ridge. For Doss, the Okinawa campaign would become the defining chapter of his wartime service, and the event that elevated him from a ridiculed conscientious objector to one of the most decorated medics in U.S. military history. The transformation that occurred between Fort Jackson and Okinawa was complete by this stage. Doss's actions during the Guam and Leyte campaigns had silenced nearly all doubt within his division. Officers viewed him as an indispensable part of the unit's combat effectiveness. His courage had demonstrated that heroism in war could take forms other than killing the enemy. The same men who once cursed his refusal to bear arms now depended on him for their survival. By the time the 77th prepared for the assault on Okinawa's fortified southern ridges, Desmond Doss had already proven his resolve through months of continuous frontline duty. His Medal of Honor citation would later reference Okinawa specifically, but the foundation of that recognition was built across Guam and Leyte, where his unarmed courage under fire earned him a place of trust among hardened infantrymen. In the Pacific War, where the environment, disease, and enemy resistance combined to test every man's endurance, Doss had established himself as a medic whose conviction was matched by his skill. The stage was now set for the battle that would define both his life and his legacy. The assault on the Leyte escarpment, where his faith, training, and courage would converge in one of the most extraordinary episodes of individual heroism in the history of World War II. By late 1944, the tide of the Pacific War had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. The U.S. Navy's victories at Midway and the Philippine Sea had destroyed much of Japan's carrier strength, and the island-hopping campaign had brought American forces to the doorstep of the Philippines. The next strategic step was Leyte Island, where General Douglas MacArthur aimed to fulfill his promise to return and liberate the archipelago from Japanese occupation. The 77th Infantry Division, including Private First Class Desmond Doss, was assigned to participate in this massive operation, which began in October 1944 and would last into the new year. For Doss, Leyte would be a defining test of endurance, discipline, and courage. Having already served in the brutal campaign on Guam, he entered this new battle with practical combat experience and the trust of many within his company. However, the environment and nature of combat on Leyte presented new challenges that stretched even the most seasoned soldiers to their limits. The Battle of Leyte began on October 20th, 1944, when the U.S. 6th Army under Lieutenant General Walter Kruger landed along Leyte Gulf. Japanese forces, numbering around 65,000 on the island, had prepared strong defensive positions in the mountains and jungles. The island's geography made it a nightmare for movement and logistics. Thick jungle, steep ridges, and constant rainfall turned the ground into mud. Vehicles became bogged down, and medical evacuation depended on manpower, improvisation, and determination. The 77th Infantry Division joined the battle in November 1944. Entering the island through the east coast near Ormoc Bay to cut off Japanese reinforcements attempting to land from the west. The 307th Infantry Regiment, to which Doss belonged, was heavily engaged in the central mountain range, where the terrain and enemy resistance combined to produce one of the most difficult campaigns in the Pacific. In jungle warfare, the role of the combat medic was both indispensable and perilous. Doss operated close to the front line, often within yards of enemy positions. The sound of Japanese mortars and machine guns was constant. Snipers targeted anyone who moved to assist the wounded, and medics were especially vulnerable since they had to expose themselves repeatedly while carrying no weapon. During the division's advance near Pina Hill, Doss's company encountered entrenched Japanese positions supported by artillery. The attack stalled under heavy fire, leaving several men wounded in exposed areas. Doss immediately moved forward despite the incoming fire. He crawled from cover to cover, applied field dressings, and dragged the wounded back to relative safety. In one instance, he treated a soldier with a severe leg wound caused by shrapnel and carried him nearly 200 yards to a protected position. Witnesses recalled that he never hesitated, even as shells landed nearby. As the unit advanced further inland, Japanese counterattacks increased in intensity. The defenders used infiltration tactics at night, slipping between American lines to strike aid stations and command posts. Doss stayed awake through long nights tending to the wounded, ensuring that each man received care before evacuation. Sleep deprivation, humidity, and disease added to the stress, but his composure remained constant. Soldiers who once doubted him began to view him as one of the most dependable men in the regiment. Evacuation on Leyte was complicated by both geography and weather. Torrential rains caused rivers to overflow, turning the battlefield into a swamp. Jeeps and stretchers often could not reach the front lines, leaving medics to carry casualties over rugged terrain. Doss frequently constructed improvised litters using saplings and ponchos, sometimes dragging the wounded behind him through knee-deep mud for hundreds of yards. Each evacuation was a calculated risk. Japanese machine gun nests often targeted movement along trails known to be used for carrying wounded soldiers. To avoid detection, Doss would sometimes move alone at night, guiding himself by the sound of moaning men. He carried plasma bottles around his neck, using them to prevent shock and stabilize those who would otherwise have died before reaching aid stations. The division's medical logs recorded significant casualty numbers during the Central Leyte operations. In the Ormoc Valley campaign alone, more than 3,500 American soldiers were killed or wounded. Doss treated dozens of these casualties personally, often under direct enemy observation. His unarmed status was well known throughout the battalion, and Japanese soldiers occasionally shouted insults toward unarmed medics, knowing they were forbidden by the Geneva Convention to carry weapons. Nevertheless, Doss continued to operate with complete disregard for his own safety. By December 1944, as the fighting for the Ormoc Corridor reached its climax, attitudes toward Doss within the 307th Infantry Regiment had transformed completely. Early in his service, some soldiers had openly mocked him as a coward. Now they regarded him as a man of exceptional bravery. Infantrymen often refused to move forward into battle without confirming that Doss would be nearby to assist if needed. One incident in particular demonstrated the shift in perception. During an assault on a ridge overlooking the Ormoc Valley, heavy Japanese fire pinned down Doss's platoon. Several men were hit and lay exposed. Doss advanced alone, treating each man in turn while the rest of the unit provided covering fire. He crawled back and forth across the kill zone multiple times. Even hardened veterans were astonished by his refusal to stop. When he finally returned to cover, he immediately began preparing to go out again as soon as another man called for help. Reports from officers of the 307th Regiment noted Doss's performance in their after-action summaries, emphasizing his unshakable composure under enemy fire and dedication to saving the lives of others. These reports would later contribute to recommendations for formal recognition. Combat on Leyte pushed all soldiers to their limits, but medics faced an especially severe burden. They witnessed every form of injury imaginable, from shrapnel and burns to tropical diseases such as malaria and dysentery. Doss treated wounds with limited supplies, often forced to reuse bandages or sterilize instruments in boiling water. He carried wounded men on his back through torrential rain and knee-deep mud. The combination of exhaustion and constant exposure to danger would have broken most soldiers. Despite these conditions, Doss remained motivated by his belief that he was performing God's work by preserving life rather than taking it. This faith-based conviction gave him remarkable mental resilience. His fellow soldiers began to see that his refusal to bear arms was not weakness, but a different kind of strength, one that allowed him to operate calmly amid chaos. The 77th Infantry Division's medical detachment reported that Doss treated hundreds of soldiers during the Leyte campaign. On several occasions, he provided care to Japanese prisoners as well, adhering strictly to medical ethics despite the risk of hostile reactions from his own side. His refusal to discriminate between friend and foe further distinguished him among his peers. By December, the fighting for Leyte had concentrated around the Ormoc Valley, a critical supply route for Japanese forces. The 77th Division was tasked with capturing the valley and cutting off Japanese reinforcements. The terrain consisted of rice paddies, ridges, and dense jungle, ideal for ambushes. The Japanese defenders employed hidden artillery and machine guns, inflicting heavy casualties. Doss was constantly at the front, moving between the foxholes and the wounded. Japanese mortar shells frequently exploded near his aid stations. Once, a direct hit destroyed a temporary shelter where he had been treating casualties moments earlier. Instead of retreating, Doss moved the surviving wounded to another position and resumed his work. He seemed impervious to fear, his focus always on stabilizing patients. Soldiers recalled that he rarely spoke unless giving medical instructions and that his movements were methodical and precise. During one night attack, Japanese forces infiltrated the perimeter of Doss's company. Intense close-quarters fighting broke out in the dark. Amid confusion and gunfire, Doss moved between positions, bandaging wounds and administering morphine. Despite having no weapon, he refused to seek cover. Several men later credited him with saving their lives that night by preventing them from bleeding out before dawn. As the Leyte campaign drew to a close in December 1944, Doss's actions had become widely known across the 77th Division. His commanding officer recommended him for another Bronze Star Medal for bravery in the face of enemy fire and tireless devotion to his duty as a medic. This second award formally recognized his conduct across the entire campaign, including the actions in the Ormoc Valley. More importantly, his personal reputation had shifted from that of an oddity to a symbol of integrity. Officers who once questioned his suitability for service now cited him as an example of moral conviction under fire. Fellow soldiers began attending Sabbath worship services with him during brief rest periods, a gesture of respect that reflected how fully he had earned their trust. Doss's presence had a measurable effect on morale within his company. Knowing that an unarmed medic would risk his life to reach them gave many soldiers a sense of reassurance. It reduced panic during engagements, as wounded men knew that Doss would come for them regardless of the circumstances. In reports compiled after the campaign, commanders noted that the division's casualty survival rate was improved by the quick action of frontline medics like Doss. When the Battle of Leyte officially ended in late December 1944, the island was declared secure, though isolated Japanese forces continued to resist into 1945. The campaign cost the United States more than 15,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. For Doss, it marked another chapter of unbroken service under fire. He had not fired a single shot, yet his contribution was measured in the lives he saved and the confidence he inspired. After Leyte, the 77th Infantry Division regrouped and refitted in preparation for its next major assignment, the invasion of Okinawa, scheduled for the spring of 1945. Doss's record during Guam and Leyte earned him respect from all levels of command. His steadfast refusal to carry a weapon was no longer questioned. It was accepted as an integral part of his identity. Before departure, the division conducted medical debriefings and training in casualty evacuation techniques based on lessons learned in Leyte's jungle terrain. Doss participated in these sessions, instructing new medics on how to operate under fire with limited supplies. His practical experience was invaluable, and junior medics looked to him as a mentor. As the division boarded ships bound for Okinawa, many soldiers privately expressed that they would not want to go into battle without him. Doss's transition from an outcast at Fort Jackson to a respected comrade on Leyte was now complete. He had demonstrated through action that moral conviction and military effectiveness could coexist, even in the most brutal theaters of World War II. The Battle of Leyte solidified Desmond Doss's reputation within the 77th Infantry Division. His work as a combat medic under relentless artillery and small arms fire proved that courage could exist in a form that did not rely on killing. Through endurance, skill, and faith, he redefined what it meant to serve honorably in war. The experiences on Leyte not only prepared him for the greater ordeal ahead at Okinawa, but also cemented his standing as one of the most extraordinary figures in the Pacific Campaign. a man who turned the act of saving lives into a battlefield weapon more powerful than any rifle. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final and most violent stage. The island of Okinawa, just 340 miles south of mainland Japan, became the site of the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater. For the U.S. military, Okinawa was essential for establishing air bases to launch a possible invasion of Japan itself. For the Japanese, it was the last defensive barrier before the homeland. Into this brutal campaign, the 77th Infantry Division, including Desmond Doss and his medical detachment, was sent to capture one of the most heavily fortified positions on the island. The Maeda Escarpment, known among American troops as Hacksaw Ridge. The Maeda Escarpment was a steep, jagged cliff about 400 feet high, running across the southern part of Okinawa. On top of it, the Japanese 24th Division had established a complex defense system of interlocking bunkers, caves, and tunnels connected by underground passages. Every approach was covered by machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire. American assaults on similar terrain throughout the Pacific, from Peleliu to Iwo Jima, had shown what kind of resistance could be expected. For Doss's unit, Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, the mission was clear but deadly: scale the escarpment and secure the plateau above. The battle for the escarpment began on April 29, 1945. Under intense naval and artillery bombardment, U.S. forces moved toward the base of the cliff, carrying ropes and cargo nets to climb. Japanese defenses were largely unaffected by the preliminary shelling as their positions were deep underground. When the first wave of soldiers reached the top, they were immediately met with concentrated machine gun and mortar fire. The advance stalled and casualties mounted rapidly. As a combat medic, Doss's duty was to treat the wounded where they fell. Unlike other medics who carried sidearms for protection, Doss climbed the escarpment with nothing but his medical kit and his Bible. He followed the infantry up the ropes under fire, reaching the top moments after the first assault began. The fighting was chaotic. Japanese soldiers launched counterattacks from hidden caves, using grenades and small arms to inflict maximum damage. Within hours, the plateau was littered with wounded Americans. When the order came to withdraw, most of the surviving men climbed back down the ropes. But Doss stayed behind. The exact timeline of Doss's actions over the next several hours remains one of the most remarkable personal accounts of World War II. According to the official Medal of Honor citation and multiple eyewitness testimonies, he spent approximately 12 hours alone on the escarpment after the withdrawal, moving from one wounded soldier to another under continuous enemy fire. He treated the injured, applied tourniquets, bandaged wounds, and administered morphine from his kit. Without assistance and with no weapon to defend himself, he dragged or carried each casualty to the edge of the cliff. Using a rope he had tied to a tree stump, he lowered them one by one to safety, estimating later that he had saved around 75 men that night. Soldiers below initially believed that the Japanese were sending bodies down the ridge. Only later did they realize that the man silhouetted against the sky was Doss, methodically lowering the wounded. He used a simple system, securing the injured with a makeshift sling and easing them down by hand. Each descent was exposed to enemy observation. Japanese soldiers fired repeatedly in his direction, yet he was never hit during that phase of the operation. Some survivors reported that Doss paused after each successful rescue to pray for strength to reach one more man. When dawn broke on April 30th, the escarpment was still under Japanese control, but dozens of Americans were alive below because of Doss's efforts. His company, inspired by the reports of his actions, prepared for another assault, this time When the men of the 307th Infantry climbed the ropes again, many asked that Doss be allowed to pray for them before they went up. The request reflected how dramatically attitudes had changed since Fort Jackson. Soldiers who had once mocked his refusal to carry a weapon now viewed him as their most dependable comrade in battle. The renewed assault was successful in establishing a foothold on the ridge. Over the next several days, Doss continued his medical duties, working without rest and frequently under fire. On May 2nd, he braved Japanese machine guns to rescue a wounded officer lying 200 yards ahead of the American lines. Crawling through open terrain, he treated the officer and dragged him back through heavy fire. Later that same day, he ran through a barrage to assist 4 men who had been hit by a grenade. One of them had suffered catastrophic injuries. Doss treated him on the spot and carried him to safety. 2 days later, on May 5th, Doss's company faced another counterattack. Japanese troops broke through the lines at night, forcing hand-to-hand combat across the ridge. In the confusion, Doss was wounded in the leg by a grenade blast. He treated himself with a bandage and refused evacuation, remaining with his unit to care for others. On May 21st, he was hit again, this time by a sniper's bullet that shattered his arm while he was tending to the wounded. Using a rifle stock as a splint, he crawled 300 yards to reach an aid station. By the end of May, the Leyte escarpment was finally secured, and the 77th Infantry Division prepared for redeployment. The battle for Okinawa as a whole would continue until June, resulting in over 12,500 American dead and more than 100,000 Japanese military casualties, along with tens of thousands of civilians. For Doss's unit, the cost had been severe, but his individual efforts had preserved a significant portion of their manpower. Field reports later confirmed that his rescues had directly influenced the company's ability to hold positions on the ridge. The scale of Doss's heroism was formally recognized in reports from company officers and medical personnel. Captain Jack Glover, who had once sought Doss's discharge for refusing to bear arms, submitted a detailed statement describing his conduct under fire. Other witnesses confirmed the accuracy of the rescue count. The division's medical officer, Captain Thomas Howell, testified that Doss's calm under pressure had saved lives not only through his physical efforts, but also through his example, which prevented panic during critical phases of the battle. Doss's refusal to carry a weapon had initially been viewed as insubordination, but on Okinawa, it became the symbol of absolute dedication to his role as a non-combatant medic. The U.S. Army recognized that his actions fully aligned with the principles of the Geneva Convention governing medical personnel: neutrality, protection of life, and service under fire. His ability to maintain those principles in the most violent combat environment of the war made him unique among Allied soldiers. After being evacuated from Okinawa, Doss underwent multiple surgeries for his injuries and contracted tuberculosis, which would affect his health for the rest of his life. Yet before he left the Pacific Theater, word of his deeds had already reached higher command. The official recommendation for the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military decoration, was submitted in June 1945. It cited not only his 75 rescues at Leyte Escarpment, but also his consistent heroism throughout the campaign. The Battle of Okinawa marked both the culmination of Desmond Doss's wartime service and one of the final major ground battles of World War II. For the 77th Infantry Division, the operation represented a strategic victory at enormous cost. For Doss, it was the ultimate test of conviction, a confirmation that his decision to serve without a weapon did not reduce his effectiveness as a soldier. His conduct at Okinawa demonstrated that courage and faith could exist within the harshest realities of modern warfare, not as sentiment, but as verifiable battlefield performance. When Doss finally left the island on a stretcher, carried by men who had once doubted him, his story had already become legend within the division. The Leyte escarpment, known for its impossible defenses, had become inseparable from the image of a single medic who defied both enemy fire and conventional expectations of combat. His 75 rescues were not an abstract figure. Each represented a documented survival, a wounded soldier who returned home because one unarmed man refused to abandon his duty. As the war in the Pacific moved toward its end with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Doss's actions at Okinawa stood as one of the last great examples of individual heroism in World War II. His name would later be listed among the few who received the Medal of Honor for non-combat service, a distinction that placed him in a category of his own. The events on that ridge demonstrated that even in the deadliest battle of the Pacific Campaign, it was possible for one man to save rather than destroy, to fulfill his military duty without firing a single shot. When Desmond Doss was finally evacuated from Okinawa in late May 1945, his war was over. His body bore the marks of relentless combat service. Multiple shrapnel wounds, a fractured arm from a sniper's bullet, and a serious infection that would later be diagnosed as tuberculosis. For months, he had endured the strain of frontline duty without the protection of a weapon or the benefit of rest. The rescue missions on the Leyte escarpment had pushed his endurance to the absolute limit. Yet even in evacuation, Doss' actions remained consistent with his sense of duty. He insisted that other wounded men be treated before himself. He was transported from Okinawa to Guam for emergency surgery, then to the U.S. mainland for further recovery at Army hospitals. The damage to his arm and leg required repeated operations, and his weakened immune system led to a prolonged battle with tuberculosis. The illness would eventually cost him one lung and leave him with lasting respiratory problems. At the time, his case was considered a severe medical discharge. The Army recognized that he would never return to active service. But the reports accompanying his file included extensive documentation of his heroism. By the time Doss was recovering in a stateside hospital, word of his actions had circulated through the U.S. military. Reports from officers of the 77th Infantry Division described a medic who had refused to retreat under fire, saving dozens of lives on Okinawa. Field surgeons verified that the men he rescued were treated promptly after being lowered from the escarpment, confirming that his actions had direct, immeasurable impact on survival rates. These statements were compiled into the official recommendation for the Medal of Honor, the highest award for valor in the U.S. Armed Forces. On October 12, 1945, President Harry S. Truman presented the Medal of Honor to Corporal Desmond Thomas Doss in a formal ceremony at the White House. The citation read in part that Doss had conspicuously distinguished himself by gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty. Truman, who had personally approved the award, later told Doss that receiving the Medal of Honor was one of the proudest moments of his presidency. As Doss stood before him in uniform, frail but upright, Truman shook his hand and said, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being President Doss became the first conscientious objector in U.S. history to receive the Medal of Honor." The term conscientious objector had long carried negative connotations in military and civilian circles. During World War I, objectors were often viewed as cowards or unpatriotic, and some had been imprisoned for refusing military service. By World War II, U.S. law permitted conscientious objectors to serve in non-combat roles through the Selective Training in Service Act of 1940, but they were still subject to suspicion within the ranks. Doss's example fundamentally changed how that classification was understood. Unlike most objectors who declined to serve entirely, Doss volunteered for combat duty. His refusal to carry a weapon was not a rejection of military service, but an interpretation of his Seventh-day Adventist faith that forbade taking life. The Army's decision to allow him to serve as a combat medic under the status of a conscientious cooperator had been controversial when he enlisted. By the war's end, his actions at Guam, Leyte, and especially Okinawa demonstrated that a soldier could uphold both religious conviction and military responsibility at the highest level of courage. The Medal of Honor citation for Doss covered his entire period of service on Okinawa between April 29th and May 21st, 1945. It documented his repeated exposure to enemy fire while rescuing and treating the wounded, his voluntary stays behind enemy lines, and his care for others even while seriously injured. The specific figure of 75 men rescued became part of the historical record based on eyewitness accounts from his unit, confirmed during post-battle debriefings. In total, he had served more than 2 years in uniform and participated in 3 major campaigns in the Pacific before being incapacitated. Following the ceremony, Doss was medically discharged and returned to civilian life in Virginia. The transition was difficult. His physical injuries required continuous treatment, and his tuberculosis kept him in and out of military hospitals for over 5 years. Much of 1 lung and 5 ribs were surgically removed. He lost significant hearing after complications from the disease and later required hearing aids for the rest of his life. Despite these challenges, Doss remained humble and largely avoided public attention. He refused offers for commercial endorsements and limited his public speaking to veterans events and church gatherings. Within the U.S. Army Medical Department, Doss's actions were studied as a case of extreme field heroism. After-action reports and training materials for medics in the late 1940s and early 1950s began to cite Okinawa as an example of the critical role of medical personnel under fire. His conduct reinforced the Geneva Convention principles that combat medics were to be respected as non-combatants, identifiable by the Red Cross armband, and protected while performing their duties. In practice, the Japanese had often ignored such conventions, targeting medics deliberately. Doss's survival despite those conditions added weight to discussions about the ethical and operational status of unarmed medical staff in future conflicts. For the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Doss's service had immense significance. During the war, many Adventists faced skepticism for their conscientious objector status. Doss's recognition by the U.S. government and his explicit acknowledgement of faith as the reason for his restraint elevated the public perception of Adventist service members. Church publications documented his award as proof that conviction and patriotism were not incompatible. In the broader American military establishment, Doss's example contributed to a gradual shift in how conscientious objectors were treated. By the time of the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, procedures for assigning non-combat personnel were more standardized, and medics and chaplains were better integrated into combat units. Training programs began to emphasize the moral dimension of medical service in combat zones, using cases like Doss's to illustrate that valor did not depend on the use of force. The public learned more about Doss's story through wartime newsreels and print articles. Newspapers across the country reported on the unusual fact of an unarmed Medal of Honor recipient. The Army's press office highlighted his courage as part of a campaign to recognize the diversity of heroism among service members. In the years following the war, Doss received additional decorations, including the Bronze Star Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters and 3 Purple Hearts for his wounds. Despite his fame, Doss lived modestly. He married Dorothy Schutte, a fellow Seventh-day Adventist nurse who had written to him during his recovery. They settled in Georgia, where he worked as a carpenter and raised a family. He continued to suffer from chronic illness caused by his wartime injuries, but remained active in veterans associations. He regularly attended reunions of the 77th Infantry Division and maintained close friendships with men he had rescued on Okinawa. Many of them credited him with their survival and often referred to him simply as Doc. Over time, The U.S. Army and Department of Defense formally acknowledged the historical importance of Doss's service. In 1963, his story was included in the official Army Center of Military History's Medal of Honor documentation. By the 1970s, it appeared in training manuals for combat medics and non-combatant personnel. The case was frequently cited in ethics courses at military academies, illustrating the coexistence of personal belief and battlefield duty. Desmond Doss's later life reflected his enduring humility. He avoided media attention, turning down several proposals for films or dramatizations of his story, fearing that such portrayals might exaggerate or distort the facts. Only in the 1990s, when the documentary The Conscientious Objector was produced with his approval, did he allow a full public account. His story reached a new generation when the 2016 feature film Hacksaw Ridge accurately depicted his World War II experience based on military records and eyewitness testimony. In military historical analysis, Doss's heroism occupies a distinct place. While many soldiers were recognized for valor in direct combat, Doss's bravery was entirely rooted in rescue under fire. His achievements demonstrated that heroism was not limited to the act of attacking the enemy, but could also exist in the preservation of life under identical risk. This perspective influenced later humanitarian approaches to military medicine and civil defense, where unarmed service became an integral part of wartime operations. By the end of his life, Doss had received multiple national honors. In addition to the Medal of Honor, he was awarded the Combat Medical Badge, the Good Conduct Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal. He passed away on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87, having lived long enough to see his example recognized worldwide as one of the most extraordinary individual acts of courage in the Second World War. Within World War II history, Desmond Doss represents a rare synthesis of faith, discipline, and duty. His actions at Guam, Leyte, and Okinawa stand alongside the most intense combat episodes of the Pacific Campaign. Yet his contribution differed in nature. Instead of destroying enemy forces, he neutralized the effects of combat by saving human lives. In military terms, his actions preserved manpower and morale within his unit, directly influencing operational outcomes. In human terms, they redefined the meaning of service under fire. The U.S. Army's later recognition of conscientious objectors owed much to Doss's example. His conduct proved that personal conviction did not diminish military effectiveness. After the war, policies surrounding religious accommodation and non-combatant service were revised to ensure fair treatment for those whose beliefs prevented them from bearing arms. His legacy also extended beyond military institutions, inspiring discussions in international humanitarian law and influencing how medics were trained to operate in modern conflicts from Vietnam to Iraq. Desmond Doss's Medal of Honor did not symbolize defiance of military authority, but rather its highest ideal: courage, sacrifice, and loyalty to comrades. His story remains one of the clearest demonstrations in World War II history that moral conviction and battlefield effectiveness can coexist. The Maeda Escarpment, once a symbol of Japanese resistance, became equally a symbol of American compassion and resolve through his deeds. From a young man in Lynchburg, Virginia, who refused to touch a weapon, to a medic whose name is permanently inscribed among the greatest heroes of the Second World War, Doss's journey encapsulates the full measure of individual faith within collective struggle. His life stands as historical evidence that even in the most mechanized and destructive conflict in human history, one man's courage to save, rather than to kill, could alter both lives and the legacy of a generation.